Leaving the UK for good. What should you consider when it comes to your financial life? So in this video, I'm going to talk about leaving the UK for good and the kind of financial considerations to take into account. And before doing that, go over to adamfire.com, especially if you're an expat or a high net wealth individual, and see how I can help you. Now, this kind of leads me to something, and obviously a lot of people watching this maybe are considering being future expats. And the thing is, in this day and age, when a lot of things have changed in terms of the tax rules, there's many things you have to take into account as a British person living overseas, and these things can also affect your investments and bank accounts and many other things. Now, obviously this video is not formal tax advice, and the tax rules are always changing. But what I can say is, over time, for British people living overseas, things have become a bit stricter. I believe many decades ago, if somebody spent less than 183 days, or especially 90 days, in the UK, pretty much, it was easy not to pay any tax. But things have increasingly changed. So now, for example, HMRC has the ties test. So if you're spending as little as 20 or 30, 40 days or whatever in the UK, you might be a UK tax resident in certain circumstances, which kind of leads me to the first tip. And that's that really you should reduce your ties as much as possible to the UK when you go overseas. That doesn't mean never setting foot in the UK. That doesn't mean never doing anything in the UK business-wise. But it does mean kind of limit your ties to the UK. Don't spend a lot of time in the UK. Also, don't keep your bank accounts open, or at least active. You can maybe keep them open, but not active. And one of the reasons for that is not only are many banks closing down the accounts of UK expats, as I've mentioned on another video, but in addition to that, more and more countries are asking non-residents to prove they are non-residents, to show intent. So, for example, the Canadians and the Australian governments are already doing this, where they're basically saying, well, we expect expats not only not to spend too much time here, but also close down their gym membership, not use the local bank accounts, and so on and so forth. So basically, the UK government needs money, so they might not be overly strict with this now, but it's better in the future where you can really prove, I changed my financial life. When I left the UK, I really cut my ties to the UK. I stopped using my bank account regularly. I didn't spend too many days in the UK. I invested offshore, not in the UK, and so on and so forth. In comparison, if you're spending 80 or 90 days a year in the UK, you're using your UK bank account to get your salary, you're investing in a brokerage account to buy stocks and shares using your parents' correspondent address and those kind of things, there's always risks. And I think those risks will increase going forward as the rules get tighter in the UK. Fortunately, unlike Americans, British people don't have to renounce citizenship when they go overseas to not pay tax back home. However, you also have to factor in taxes like tax on UK assets and also inheritance tax. So a lot of people think if they're from the UK, if they move to Dubai or Cayman Islands or any low or no tax jurisdiction, that means they don't have to pay any tax to the UK government. But it's fairly easy not to have to pay things like income tax and dividend tax and so on if you've got assets outside of the UK. But if you invest in UK property and you've got a portfolio of properties, then basically you still have to pay tax on that specific UK sourced income when you're overseas. So you might want to consider whether it's a good time to sell out and then invest in more tax efficient structures. In addition to that, the biggest risk I think by far the wealthier expats make when they are non-resident is they confuse domicile and residency. So residency and tax residency isn't the same as domicile, and UK inheritance tax is typically based on domicile. So you could have spent decades outside the UK, but you could still, or your heirs, your children or whatever, could still pay 40% on your estate if you died. So you should consider things like trusts and other things, especially if you're a bit older, wills, and also maybe life insurance and other things that could cover that liquidity risk, because there's a hell of a lot of people who make this mistake and then they panic when they're older and kind of put in those structures because they wrongly think that, oh, I've been a non-resident for decades, so I don't have to pay any UK inheritance tax. And a lot of people could get in trouble with this, especially when it comes to illiquid assets. You imagine a wealthy family who has 10 million in property and they're British, and then suddenly they could be facing a 4 million or 3 million pound inheritance tax bill, and they might not be able to pay that quickly unless they sell off the assets. So really consider your inheritance tax risks and also how to mitigate them, whether that's a trust or whether that's setting up a life insurance policy to pay for the inheritance tax. But that's definitely something to consider. One of the few times when it makes sense to increase your ties to the UK is when there are specific government schemes which is encouraging expats to save and invest more money. So I'll give you an example of that. Whilst it's true to say that ISAs are not legal for non-residents, it's possible for UK people living overseas to pay a voluntary, I think it's about £3 a week, something like £168 a year, contribution to national insurance. And that's a steal because it means you can get a full state pension upon retirement based on investing or contributing a very small amount of money. However, you also have to consider the risks because obviously the UK has an aging population, the government needs money, as I mentioned earlier, which is one of the reasons they might go after some expats in the future. But also, that means that the UK retirement age might keep going up. So I would say if you're in your 50s, it's a non-brainer to kind of backdate your payments as an expat and take advantage of this particular option. But if you're in your 20s or 30s or even 40s, it does seem like a good option, but I would also consider where the risk of the government kind of reneging on their promises and delaying retirement for people is you've got to factor in that risk essentially. So basically what I would say in conclusion is for most British people living overseas, not just British people, Canadians, Australians and others, it's good to reduce and even remove as many ties back home as possible in terms of financial ties. There are exceptions to that. I mentioned the one about national insurance, but in general, that is the case. And also though, the positive side about moving offshore is that often you do have extra opportunities you won't have in the UK. So for example, if you're living in the UK and you want to invest in tax efficient structures or in countries that have no taxation on real estate, as a UK taxpayer, you still have to pay to the UK government in most cases. Whereas if you move overseas to certain no tax or low tax jurisdictions, it also increases your investment opportunities and indeed your financial opportunities. But by the same token, it's important to reduce your risk when it comes to the UK taxation side, because I do think in the coming years, the rules are going to get stricter and stricter.
Depends on every person's individual goals, how much money they want to invest, how long they want to invest. And I did not have at all the feeling from any bank with which I had contact with that they were interested in these things. Mm-hmm. Whereas with you, it was from the very beginning obvious to me that you had experience in these matters and also were interested in what I wanted to achieve.
Anyways, I'm very, very pleased and positive to say that I believe I've picked the right one. The results in the last couple of years have overreached my expectations by far. And I see no reason why it should not continue. Of course, I can highly recommend him as your financial advisor for now and for the future, because hesitating is missing out.
So I'm investing a lot in the Middle East market, but the amount of returns I'm getting from there is very low as per the amount of returns I'm getting from the investment portfolio which you made for me. Obviously, the best result in market right now is Adam.